So that's all.
All right, kids and Sunday school teachers, it is time to roll on out. We long to be like Jesus.
Of compassion and healing and welcome to a world that is hurting. And we know that the mental health crisis in our country is alarming, it's unnerving, and we sometimes just don't know what it is that we could do about it. And so I pray that over the next 2 weeks, you might give us some insight, some tools, some resources to know how best to serve those around us, and even how to care for ourselves, how to stay well in this important area of our being. So would you bless the Mental Health Matters team and their important work in our church, and Marla as she teaches us this morning. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.
Good morning. My disclaimer is I'm not bad at talking and teaching, but I'm not good at talking and teaching and advancing slides, so I pray your grace on that part of things. Welcome in, as Lindsay said. Oh. You assured me that if I push this button, there we go. My husband, Jim, thank you, who assured me. All right, well, welcome. My name is Marla Golden. I am on staff here at APC as the Crossroads High School Ministry Leader, but I'm not here in that capacity today, in a different capacity, as Lindsay mentioned, as a member of the mental health ministry, which is called Mental Health Matters here at APC. I am also a licensed therapist working in an outpatient mental health capacity. And just really have a particular interest and passion around mental health and wellness for people of all ages. May, as you might or might not know, is Mental Health Awareness Month, and today is the first of 2 adult education classes focusing on our mental health and our wellness. And I hope you enjoy today, that it either begins a journey for you or continues whatever journey of mental health wellness you are on. I'm going to share a little bit about the ministry itself. I'm going to share a little bit about our recent survey, the plans that it informed, and then we're going to get into some content and conversation based on a 2014 TED Talk that is called Why We All Need to Practice Emotional First Aid by a psychologist by the name of Winch. Okay, advance. I'm going to say that every time, so just so you know. The rest of the core team of this ministry includes Mary Beth Drew, Deb O'Hare, who I know is in the back, Stephanie McMahon, Lisa Newman, and Allison Young, all of whom are dedicated to the mental health and wellness of our APC community and beyond. We all recognize the importance of emotional first aid in our lives and the lives of our family and friends. And we feel really passionately about sharing that message through our words and our actions. It did it, all right. Jim was right. I should trust him more. About a year ago, that core team that I mentioned gathered to pray and to dream about our ministry's mission and the needs of the church community and what we could and couldn't do. This mission statement captures the intentions of the ministry in 4 particular areas. We can support this ministry by raising awareness, addressing stigma, developing an understanding of all mental health issues. Maybe not all mental health issues, but as many as we possibly can. We can also do this by supporting individuals and families who are affected by mental health, by mental illness, both in their spirituality and practically. We can also do this by advocating for individuals and families who seek care, and by encouraging and providing opportunities for mental health and wellness and recovery. Okay. As we planned, though, we wanted to make sure that we weren't sort of just creating a vision out of our heads, but we wanted to create a vision that was informed by our congregation and community, and to ensure that our plans were aligned with the needs of the people. And to that end, we created and distributed a brief survey on mental health, and we sent it out in early March. We sent out about 670 surveys to everyone who was 18 and older in our congregation, in our community, in the church's associated ministries. including the Grapevine and Crossroads Constant Contact. So we set it out in a bunch of different ways. And we hoped for a 10% response rate, which is what we got. We got about little more. We got about 69 responses back. And I would like to just briefly review the results and the next steps with you. Okay. All right, this one's going to be a lot of words, and then I promise we're going to get to the fun stuff. So looking at those 4 areas that the Mental Health Matters ministry identified early on, the first was awareness and education. And so the survey told us that what people really want are outside speakers and an adult education series or multiple adult education series. So here we are today in adult ed. I am not a guest speaker, but we do have a speaker who is coming in next week to do the second part of this, to talk about the loneliness epidemic. And she is not only a local pastor in Lawrenceville, but she is also a licensed clinical social worker. So we intend to honor that by hopefully doing more classes in the future and to bring in as many speakers as we can. In the second area of personal support, the request that we saw was for facilitated support groups and hosted events for fun and fellowship, really opportunities for people to get together and make connections. And one thing that we realized is that in a church like APC that is so active and has so many things going on, sometimes there are things going on that we either can't get to or don't even know about, because maybe our little area is Crossroads or it's Little Tree. And we wanted to make sure that we could connect those things and that we're partnering with and supporting all of the ministries in the church. So, for example, do you know that APC hosts a grief share? Grief share is a support group that is a very structured support group. That's one of the things that is happening. In addition, AA meets on our campus once a week. That's not necessarily a church-sponsored, but it is here and it is available. These are existing programs that we can point to in addition to pursuing and creating other opportunities. Many of our ministries already host fun things. I know FFG is always doing something. I know that we have beach days coming up when summer starts. Shameless plug for Crossroads Competitive Volleyball League, which starts in the summer. And recently, I've actually seen one of our members out on social media trying to put together a kind of activities group for people who want to get together and do things. So there is a lot going on in our church that we want to point to, in addition to trying to create those events. Allison Young, who is one of our members, has graciously agreed to be sort of the liaison and connector to all things APC in terms of the goings-on. So stay tuned, because I know she's working on ways to point to all of those things so people know what opportunities are happening. In the area of advocacy, the one thing that we heard really strongly was that people would like a resource bank. And so in 2 sort of different directions. A resource bank for where can I find a therapist? What are the different kinds of programs that exist? And so we're working on a comprehensive resource list and a description of the mental health services that are available in our area, including those emergency mental health services, phone numbers, inpatient and outpatient care, behavioral health centers, crisis numbers, everything that we think might be helpful to somebody who is in the midst of it, because when you're in the midst of it, it's hard to know where to turn. In addition, just what kind of counseling is available out there and how to make contact. What information do you need to provide when you're trying to make contact? And what questions to ask to get the right kind of help. So that's part of the resource bank and the comprehensive list that we're putting together. And then on the other side is sort of a resource library, and that would be books, hard copies, links to purchase, maybe soft copies if we have access to them, printed booklets, informational brochures, articles, online resources, and other recommended resources that folks could have access to when they just maybe want to learn and aren't necessarily in crisis. And finally, in the area of mental health and wellness, one of the things that we heard mostly is wellness activities. What can I do for my body and for my mind in terms of wellness? And I don't know, probably half of you know this, which is, for example, in the women's ministry, we've already started to incorporate yoga into a lot of our events. And I know that we're planning some trainings in the summer and the fall that have to do with learning and with activities. All right, you made it through the most. Yeah, Lindsay. What is SA? Oh, substance, SU. Substance, yes. which actually should be SU because I don't usually say substance abuse anymore. Substance use is the correct term. Thank you for asking. All right, so that was all the words. We are going to get to the fun part very shortly. There's just two more things I wanted to point out that came from the survey. And that is that the top two mental health issues that folks identified as having affected them, either themselves or their family or friends, was anxiety and depression. This was not a surprise to us. The second was substance use and addiction. And so this information will help to guide the topics that the Mental Health Matters ministry chooses to provide for all of you. And then finally, a resounding, families and individuals really need support. That's a guiding principle for us in this group. All right, so this is the part that I'm really excited for. Well, this is just gonna be a blank slide, so I'm actually, yes, Jim, video time. As I said, this is a TED Talk from 2014, and we're gonna stop it in 3 separate places. So we're gonna watch about the first 7 minutes, do some turn and talk questions, watch the second part, turn and talk questions. Hit it.
I grew up with my identical twin, who was an incredibly loving brother. Now, one thing about being a twin is it makes you an expert at spotting favoritism. If his cookie was even slightly bigger than my cookie, I had questions. And clearly, I wasn't starving. When I became a psychologist, I began to notice favoritism of a different kind. And that is how much more we value the body than we do the mind. I spent 9 years at university earning my doctorate in psychology, and I can't tell you how many people look at my business card and say, "Oh, a psychologist, so not a real doctor." As if it should say that on my card. This favoritism, we show the body over the mind. I see it everywhere. I recently was at a friend's house, and their 5-year-old was getting ready for bed. He was standing on a stool by the sink, brushing his teeth, when he slipped and scratched his leg on the stool when he fell. He cried for a minute, but then he got back up, got back on the stool, and reached out for a box of Band-Aids to put one on his cut. Now, this kid could barely tie his shoelaces, but he knew you have to cover a cut so it doesn't become infected, and you have to care for your teeth by brushing twice a day. We all know how to maintain our physical health and how to practice dental hygiene, right? We know it since we were 5 years old. But what do we know about maintaining our psychological health? Well, nothing. What do we teach our children about emotional hygiene? Nothing. How is it we spend more time taking care of our teeth than we do our minds? Why is it our physical health is so much more important to us than our psychological health? You know, we sustain psychological injuries even more often than we do physical ones, injuries like failure or rejection or loneliness. And they can also get worse if we ignore them, and they can impact our lives in dramatic ways. And yet, even though there are scientifically proven techniques we could use to treat these kinds of psychological injuries, we don't. It doesn't even occur to us that we should. Oh, you're feeling depressed. Just shake it off. It's all in your head. Can you imagine saying that to somebody with a broken leg? Oh, just walk it off. It's all in your leg. It is time we close the gap between our physical and our psychological health. It's time we made them more equal, more like twins. Speaking of which, my brother is also a psychologist, so he's not a real doctor either. We didn't study together, though. In fact, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life is move across the Atlantic to New York City to get my doctorate in psychology. We were apart then for the first time in our lives, and the separation was brutal for both of us. But while he remained among family and friends, I was alone in a new country. We missed each other terribly, but international phone calls were really expensive then, and we could only afford to speak for 5 minutes a week. When our birthday rolled around, it was the first we wouldn't be spending together. We decided to splurge, and that week we would talk for 10 minutes. I spent the morning pacing around my room, waiting for him to call, and waiting, and waiting. But the phone didn't ring. Given the time difference, I assumed, okay, he's out with friends, he'll call later. There were no cell phones then. But he didn't. And I began to realize that after being away for over 10 months, he no longer missed me the way I missed him. Now, I knew he would call in the morning, but that night was one of the saddest and longest nights of my life. I woke up the next morning. I glanced down at the phone, and I realized I had kicked it off the hook when pacing the day before. I stumbled out of bed, I put the phone back on the receiver, and it rang a second later. And it was my brother. And boy, was he pissed. It was the saddest and longest night of his life as well. Now, I tried to explain what happened, but he said, I don't understand. If you saw I wasn't calling you, why didn't you just pick up the phone and call me? He was right. Why didn't I call him? I didn't have an answer then. But I do today, and it's a simple one. Loneliness. Loneliness creates a deep psychological wound, one that distorts our perceptions and scrambles our thinking. It makes us believe that those around us care much less than they actually do. It makes us really afraid to reach out, because why set yourself up for rejection and heartache when your heart is already aching more than you can stand? I was in the grips of real loneliness back then, but I was surrounded by people all day, so it never occurred to me. But loneliness is defined purely subjectively. It depends solely on whether you feel emotionally or socially disconnected from those around you, and I did. There is a lot of research on loneliness, and all of it is horrifying. Loneliness won't just make you miserable, it will kill you. I'm not kidding. Chronic loneliness increases your likelihood of an early death by 14%. 14%. Loneliness causes high blood pressure, high cholesterol. It even suppresses the functioning of your immune system, making you vulnerable to all kinds of illnesses and diseases. In fact, scientists have concluded that taken together, chronic loneliness poses as significant a risk for your long-term health and longevity as cigarette smoking. Now, cigarette packs come with warnings saying this could kill you, but loneliness doesn't. And that's why it's so important.
Perfect. Yep, go back to PowerPoint. So we're going to stop right here, and we're going to talk about loneliness. For the Gen Z folks in the phone, off the hook. This means in the olden days, when we didn't have cell phones, we would actually have to hang the phone up. And when you picked it up, you would hear a little tone that meant you could call. And if you kicked it off the hook, no one could call you. Okay, so I know that's an oldie. You would get a busy signal. I know you've never heard this. So I'm going to ask you at this point to share to the level of your comfort. These questions start off really easy, highs and lows, and then they get a little bit deep. And so if you're not comfortable sharing with the person or persons that are next to you, you can also use the term, I had a friend who. Trust me, it works. So we can't see the questions yet, the PowerPoint? There it is, great. Okay, so turn to talk number one. You've got about 6 minutes. We have about another minute to finish up. All right, come on back so we can jump back into our video. All right, I love that you are a chatty group, but we're going to continue. We're going to move on from loneliness. And if we have a few minutes at the very end, we can debrief our conversations. So let's jump back into our video.
Prioritize our psychological health, that we practice emotional hygiene. Because you can't treat a psychological wound if you don't even know you're injured.
You seek the key, but you must first learn the discipline. Unlock the energy within.
Loneliness isn't the only psychological wound that distorts our perceptions and misleads us. Failure does that as well. I once visited a daycare center where I saw 3 toddlers play with identical plastic toys. You had to slide the red button and a cute doggy would pop out. One little girl tried pulling the purple button, then pushing it, and then she just sat back and looked at the box with her lower lip trembling. The little boy next to her watched this happen, then turned to his box and burst into tears without even touching it. Meanwhile, another little girl tried everything she could think of until she slid the red button, the cute doggy popped out, and she squealed with delight. So, 3 toddlers with identical plastic toys, but with very different reactions to failure. The first 2 toddlers were perfectly capable of sliding a red button. The only thing that prevented them from succeeding was their mind, tricked them into believing they could not. Now, adults get tricked this way as well all the time. In fact, we all have a default set of feelings and beliefs that gets triggered whenever we encounter frustrations and setbacks. Are you aware of how your mind reacts to failure? You need to be. Because if your mind tries to convince you you're incapable of something and you believe it, then like those 2 toddlers, you'll begin to feel helpless and you'll stop trying too soon, or you won't even try at all. And then you'll be even more convinced you can't succeed. You see, that's why so many people function below their actual potential. Because somewhere along the way, sometimes a single failure convinced them that they couldn't succeed, and they believed it. Once we become convinced of something, it's very difficult to change our mind. I learned that lesson the hard way when I was a teenager with my brother. We were driving with friends down a dark road at night when a police car stopped us. There had been a robbery in the area and they were looking for suspects. The officer approached the car and he shined his flashlight on the driver, then on my brother in the front seat, and then on me, and his eyes opened wide and he said, "Where have I seen your face before?" And I said, in the front seat. But that made no sense to him whatsoever, so now he thought I was on drugs. So he drags me out of the car, he searches me, he marches me over to the police car, and only when he verified I don't have a police record could I show him I had a twin in the front seat. But even as we were driving away, you could see by the look on his face, he was convinced that I was getting away with something. Our mind is hard to change once we become convinced. So it might be very natural to feel demoralized and defeated after you fail, but you cannot allow yourself to become convinced you can't succeed. You have to fight feelings of helplessness. You have to gain control over the situation. And you have to break this kind of negative cycle before it begins. Our minds and our feelings, they're not the trustworthy friends we thought they were. They're more like a really moody friend who can be totally supportive one minute and really unpleasant the next. I once worked with this woman who, after 20 years of marriage and an extremely ugly divorce, was finally ready for her first date. She had met this guy online, and he seemed nice, and he seemed successful, and most importantly, he seemed really into her. So she was very excited. She bought a new dress, and they met at an upscale New York City bar for a drink. 10 minutes into the date, the man stands up and says, "I'm not interested," and walks out. Rejection is extremely painful. The woman was so hurt she couldn't move. All she could do was call a friend. And here's what the friend said. "Well, what do you expect? You have big hips, you have nothing interesting to say. Why would a handsome, successful man like that ever go out with a loser like you?" Shocking, right, that a friend can be so cruel. But it would be much less shocking if I told you it wasn't the friend who said that. It's what the woman said to herself. And that's something we all do, especially after a rejection. We all start thinking of all our faults and all our shortcomings, what we wish we were, what we wish we weren't. We call ourselves names, maybe not as harshly, but we all do it. And it's interesting that we do, because our self-esteem is already hurting. Why would we want to go and damage it even further? Right? We wouldn't make a physical injury worse on purpose. You wouldn't get a cut on your arm and decide, "Oh, I know, I'm going to take a knife and see how much deeper I can make it." But we do that with psychological injuries all the time. Why? Because of poor emotional hygiene. Because we don't prioritize our psychological health. We know from dozens of studies that when your self-esteem is lower, you are more vulnerable to stress and to anxiety, that failures and rejections hurt more, and it takes longer to recover from them. So when you get rejected, the first thing you should be doing is to revive your self-esteem, not join Fight Club and beat it into a pulp.
All right, we're going to take our second turn and talk. I realized when I sat down that it's very difficult to read these questions. So the first is, can you think of a time that you failed at something? How did you react? PowerPoint me. If a friend had a terrible date, what would you say to them? Is it the same thing that you would say to yourself? Why or why not? And what do you do when you experience failure or rejection? Brainstorm what else you could do instead. So go ahead. We'll take about 6 or 7 moments for that one. Friends, take about 1 more minute and then come on back. Okay, come on back and let's watch the end of our video. All right, here we go, the
You get
final
rejected,
4 minutes.
The first thing you should be doing is to revive your self-esteem, not join Fight Club and beat it into a pulp. The first thing you should be doing is to revive your self-esteem, not join Fight Club and beat it into a pulp. When you're in emotional pain, treat yourself with the same compassion you would expect from a truly good friend.
Your child needs these 3 key factors to get into an Ivy League or top 25 university. And it's A or SAT score. Let me explain. 90%.
We have to catch our unhealthy psychological habits and change them. And one of the unhealthiest and most common is called rumination. To ruminate means to chew over. It's when your boss yells at you, or your professor makes you feel stupid in class, or you have a big fight with a friend, and you just can't stop replaying the scene in your head for days, sometimes for weeks on end. Now, ruminating about upsetting events in this way can easily become a habit, and it's a very costly one. Because by spending so much time focused on upsetting and negative thoughts, you are actually putting yourself at significant risk for developing clinical depression, alcoholism, eating disorders, and even cardiovascular disease. The problem is, the urge to ruminate can feel really strong and really important, so it's a difficult habit to stop. I know this for a fact, because a little over a year ago, I developed the habit myself. You see, my twin brother was diagnosed with stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. His cancer was extremely aggressive. He had visible tumors all over his body. And he had to start a harsh course of chemotherapy. And I couldn't stop thinking about what he was going through. I couldn't stop thinking about how much he was suffering. Even though he never complained, not once. He had this incredibly positive attitude. His psychological health was amazing. I was physically healthy, but psychologically I was a mess. But I knew what to do. Studies tell us that even a 2-minute distraction is sufficient to break the urge to ruminate in that moment. And so each time I had a worrying, upsetting, negative thought, I forced myself to concentrate on something else until the urge passed. And within 1 week, my whole outlook changed and became more positive and more hopeful. 9 weeks after he started chemotherapy, my brother had a CAT scan, and I was by his side when he got the results. All the tumors were gone. He still had 3 more rounds of chemotherapy to go, but we knew he would recover. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago. By taking action when you're lonely, by changing your responses to failure, by protecting your self-esteem, by battling negative thinking, you won't just heal your psychological wounds, you will build emotional resilience, you will thrive. You know, 100 years ago, people began practicing personal hygiene, and life expectancy rates rose by over 50% in just a matter of decades. I believe our quality of life could rise just as dramatically if we all began practicing emotional hygiene. Can you imagine what the world would be like if everyone was psychologically healthier? If there were less loneliness and less depression? If people knew how to overcome failure? If they felt better about themselves and more empowered? If they were happier and more fulfilled? I can, because that's the world I want to live in. And that's the world my brother wants to live in as well. And if you just become informed and change a few simple habits, well, that's the world we can all live in. Thank you very much.
Okay, final turn and talk, and then we'll wrap it all together. So the questions are, have you experienced rumination, replaying a moment or experience over and over? How did you break that pattern? If you had to take a 2-minute distraction break, what would you do? And what does emotional hygiene or emotional first aid mean to you? How can it help you personally? Grab you back in 5 minutes. Okay, one more minute. Okay, I know that I said a minute, but I told a little bit of a lie because I want to draw you back in for our finish here. Come on back to me. So, as Christians, is it a sin if I'm depressed? Does that mean that my faith is not strong enough? No, excellent. Great audience participation. Thank you. No, but it's something that sometimes that we battle with. Yeah, it's completely normal to struggle with depression as a Christian. We're humans. Being a follower of Jesus does not make us immune to the difficulties in life and to mental health issues. In fact, we find a lot of heroes of the faith that probably had depression. Have you read the Psalms, my friends? They're not all praise and worship. There's a lot of lamentation. There's a lot of crying out in despair. Can faith alone cure depression? Maybe, I don't know, but it's okay to have a therapist and love Jesus. Depression can feel like a black hole, right? And as Christians, it's important for us to realize that it can feel hopeless and it can feel lonely, but we serve a God that has also experienced every human emotion. And he can sympathize with every weakness that we feel. And again, I would think about some of the heroes of the faith and probably what they experienced, especially if you're thinking Old Testament, but I'm sure in the New Testament too. I think that there were a lot of people out there that probably experienced it and maybe just didn't have the words for it that we have today. An hour seems like so much time when we start and then we run out. So I know one of the questions is, okay, so we've started to talk about this stuff, but what do we do, right? Well, a couple of the things that we turned and talked about, things like distraction breaks, things like brainstorming. What can you do when you're lonely? You can connect. These are things that we're going to continue to talk about because it's great to describe it. Yeah, I've been feeling that, but what do I do, right? Those are the practical things that we want to learn. I don't have copies with me here today, but if you reach out to the Mental Health Matters group, and we are super easy to get in touch with, we are mhm@allentownpresbyterian.org. We'll send this out too. There's a really great article that I would love to share with anybody that wants to read it. It's by a group called Share the Struggle, which is a nonprofit that I'm going to read, seeks to showcase God's redemptive power by meeting the world's emotional and mental health needs. And their hope is to follow Jesus' example of binding up the brokenhearted by meeting struggling people where they are. And they've got this really, really great article about depression specifically in this case, but where does my faith come into it? And that's where, these questions of what do I do? Well, you can practice gratitude. You can trust in God's plan. You can lament. You can cry out. You can do all of these things. So I'm out of time, but I really appreciate that you were here. And I invite you, I lost my little clicker thing. I invite you to come back next week for part 2, which is a conversation about the loneliness epidemic. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that is by Marcia McKillop. And she is a pastor in Lawrenceville, and she is also a clinician. So I hope that you will come back, and I hope that you have a blessed day. Thank you.